kick off the meeting. I'm Cliff with the Salud America team here at UT Health San Antonio. You're attending the 5th webinar in our 6th webinar series, Let's Address Health Equity Together. Today's webinar is Why Should I Think About Joining a Clinical Trial? Our moderator is Dr. Amelie G. Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez is Director of Salud America and its home base, Institute for Health Promotion Research at UT Health San Antonio. She spent over 30 years directing communication research to reduce chronic disease and cancer health disparities among Latinos. She's also Associate Director of Cancer Outreach and Engagement at the NCI designated Mays Cancer Center here at UT Health San Antonio. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Ramirez.
Great. Thank you very much, Cliff. And good evening to all our participants. We really want to thank you for joining us tonight. We also want to thank our special panelists who are here and are giving of their time to share their insights about clinical trials. You know, we all know the importance of clinical trials, and clinical trials have truly wonderful benefits. But clinical trials help our researchers learn more about how to slow, manage, and find better treatments for different health problems that affect our community, such as cancer and Alzheimer's disease and a number of other health problems as well. But we're interested in finding out how clinical trials can not only help us personally, but help our abuelos or our moms and dads, our friends and colleagues, and how can this truly, you know, make a difference for our loved ones. So then, you know, we also want to understand that, you know, clinical trials is why Latinos don't often participate in clinical trials. And so our Latino community is recently has grown in size. We're now the majority minority in the United States, and we represent almost 19% of the US population, yet we're very underrepresented in clinical trials. For example, less than 10% have joined any National Cancer Institute trials, and less than 4% have participated in any of our FDA or drug-related trials. So, you know, fortunately today, what we want to talk about is how can we break down some of those barriers and encourage our community to participate? How can we explore trials and other treatment options for our community? And also to look at what not only the barriers, but what are some things that would actually motivate and encourage our community to participate in clinical trials, and also to hear from individuals who are survivors themselves and why they feel it's important to participate in clinical trials. And most of all, what can we do as collectively to encourage some proposed system changes and strategies on how we can increase the enrollment in clinical trials. So this evening, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly introduce our 3 speakers that are with us today. First, I'll start off with Dr. Adolfo Diaz Duque. Dr. Duque is a hematologist oncologist at our NCI designated Mays Cancer Center here at UT Health San Antonio. And his research and clinical trials focus on improving the outcomes of patients with lymphomas and on healthcare disparities in our underrepresented minorities. Also at the Mays Cancer Center, he's developing a research program investigating novel therapies in Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Also with us from Puerto Rico is Dr. Bárbara Segarra-Vázquez. She is a faculty member at the University of Puerto Rico. She's been there over 30 years with Puerto Rico and has done so much, not only there, but nationally. She's a leader for one of the National Institutes of Minority Health Disparities training programs to train the next generation of young investigators. She's also a member of our Southwest Oncology Cancer Center Delivery Committee, as well as the Patient Advocacy Committee. And she's also a patient advocate for the Susan G. Komen Foundation. And she herself is a 2-time breast cancer survivor. So we look forward to hearing her remarks. But our next speaker and our first speaker that I'd like to introduce this evening, really, we're grateful to Genentech. They are our webinar sponsors. And Genentech is a biotechnology company and a member of the Roche Group. Representing Genentech today is Dr. Juan Acosta. He is a U.S. board certified neurologist who is currently a senior medical director and manager of the neuroimmunology group at the U.S. Medical Affairs at Genentech. He also has extensive experience in academia and private neurology and has practiced in the U.S. Dr. Acosta has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for the past 7 years, addressing patient medical needs and also in various neurodegenerative and neuroinflammatory disorders, including multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and ALS. So really, it's a pleasure tonight to have Dr. Acosta with us. And can you please share your thoughts with us in terms of clinical trials and why is seeing diversity in clinical trials so important to Genentech, Dr. Acosta?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramirez, and thank you everybody for the opportunity as well as for the members of the panel. It's a real pleasure to be here today with all of you. And, you know, not only as a doctor, also as a medical director for a pharmaceutical company like Genentech. And I think that one of the things that Genentech has is that our core mission basically is improving the health outcome for all patients. And when we talk about all patients, is that we want to be inclusive. We want to have the right representation in our clinical studies and make sure that when we provide information about our product, we're also taking into consideration how is this medication affecting those individuals in the minority groups that, as you said before, we're not such a minority anymore, but I think that we're still very underrepresented in all the clinical studies. And you put some numbers in there, but it's also when you look at the numbers that 1 out of every 100 Hispanic patients actually participate in clinical study. And this is not much better actually when we look at an African-American population and when we look at cross clinical studies, not only in neuroscience, but in oncology, et cetera, the representation of minorities is less than 10%. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that when we are, as a company, we're committed basically in how do we advance inclusive research. And what we've done is to move forward with a very proactive way to accomplish this. So first, we want to recruit more representative population into the clinical studies. And this is reflected by a commitment that we have for 2025, where we want to make sure that every clinical study that we put in place has some strategy to make sure that we guarantee the appropriate representation of the different groups. I think that this is very important because it will provide the need to think in advance how we can optimize the way that we're going to bring this minority representation into these clinical studies. Second, we want to diversify the data. We want to understand the data across all the patients. And I think that this is very important because that will help us to understand the benefit of the drug, the safety profile, et cetera, which usually is based in a population that is not representative of who we are. And finally, I think another component of this is how do we strengthen and build these external coalitions and partnerships. And as you can see, these one of the initiatives, the Advanced Inclusive Research Site Alliance, and I know that Dr. Diaz, Duque is on Mays Cancer Center, and this is one of the participants. And what we try to do is collaborate with sites, with scientific sites where patients are being seen, and then understand with them how we can better reach and have this underrepresented community to participate in the study. So as you can see, it's a way for us actually not only to provide the initiative to the community, but also to learn from those initiatives so we can actually implement that in the process of going ahead with planning and executing in our own clinical studies. It's important, and we're going to talk about today, is that, when we talk about clinical research, there's a lot of questions that we're going to answer. Is this right for me? Why is important to advance clinical research, et cetera. And I think that this is a phenomenal component that will be important, obviously, in the success in the future to understand how medication works across the entire population. The other thing that we put in place is something called on the patient navigator plane, is how can we put on the sites and how can we incorporate into clinical studies the ability to provide services at the patient level on those sites where those patients are going to participate. So in other final words, just because of the short time, I want to say that we already have initiated. We're walking the talk. We have clinical studies. I'm the medical lead for the first minority studies in the MS population. It's called the CHIMES study. The company also did a study called the Impacta during COVID with a drug protocol and Terra. And certainly 84% of the patients that we recruited were within these minority groups. And now on the ophthalmology side, we also have a study that is currently recruiting with the Elevatum, basically also looking at how to enhance the ability to incorporate patients related to diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema. So a lot of things going on, a lot of things that the company per se is doing, a lot of things that we're bringing forward, a lot of learning during this process, and a lot of work with the community and with the site and with the investigator to be able to really propel this to the next level so we can be careful in how do we succeed in bringing patients on minority groups into the clinical studies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Costa. And I think you mentioned something that is extremely important, that, you know, some of these diseases that are different pharma companies are trying to better understand, they're higher in our Latino population. For example, cancer is now the leading cause of death for Latinos. Alzheimer's is also, you know, has infecting a large number of Latinos. But if we're not represented in these clinical trials, how can we make sure that these drugs are really as effective as they should be for all our populations? So thank you, and I'll come back to you for some additional questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Diaz Duque, and as you can you share with us your experience with the challenges of some of our cancer patients and getting them to participate in clinical trials, or how have clinical trials helped them?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Amelie, for the invitation. I can tell you, know, the experience comes from overcoming those challenges, right? Which is hard, but let me see if I can share my screen here. I have a few slides. It's in presentation mode. Is it? Can you see those?
Presentation mode is at the bottom. Can you see it here at the bottom? Perfect.
There you go. There you go. Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. So once again, I am a hematologist oncologist with focus on lymphoma care and healthcare disparities. I'm the lead of the adult lymphoma program here at Mace Cancer Center, and I'm gonna utilize the example of our own institution as to, you know, what's going on with Hispanics in the country. So this is us. This is UT, right? 15 institutions, 9 out of those are academic, but 3 out of those 9 have a medical schools. You know, our big sister is MD Anderson, and then we have UT Southwestern, and then us here in San Antonio, and then UT Austin. Okay, we basically cover 38 counties of South Texas. We cover 4.9 million people. That's our catchment area. And guess what? You know, the majority are Hispanics. We are Hispanics, 69%. Most of those younger, poorer, less educated, and close to half of those are non-English speakers. You can see here the most prevalent cancers, you know, prostate, breast, leukemia. You can see also disproportionate cancers happening here, liver, cervical, leukemias, gallbladder, gastric cancer, right? And then you may say, you know, why are you talking about Texas? You know, why are you zooming in Texas? But if you zoom out, you know, this is Hispanics in U.S. You clearly see, you know, the top 3 states where Hispanics reside. You would see Texas here, you would see Florida, you would see California, and Hispanics by now, you know, a little bit more than 60 million people, close to 20% of the U.S. population. And as Dr. Ramirez was just saying, you know, cancer is the leading cause of death among Hispanics, 20%. 20% of tests are related to cancer. We basically pay attention to several items here because those basically impact the outcomes as far as cancer concerns. When you look at socioeconomic status, for instance, understanding that you can measure that by paying attention to the income and the education, you know, those are the most critical factors that are nowadays affecting health, longevity, and quality of life. Access to care, it's critical, you know. Do you have a primary care physician? Can you afford a copayment? Or is there even a primary care physician near where you reside? So that's another item to consider. And then you have cultural values and beliefs, things like language, values and traditions. And a very important phenomenon here happening among Hispanics, you know, something called acculturation, which is the adoption among immigrants of attitudes, values, customs, beliefs, and behaviors of the host country. Okay. Now, if you zoom in again, you would see that Texas is no different than the whole country. Our patients, the majority are minorities here, right? There's disparities in income, there's disparities in education, there's roadblocks like access to care, transportation, patients who are underfunded or unfunded, and to some extent, our commitment goes to leveraging our infrastructure to South Texas to have those patients or to get to those patients to clinical trials. And that's where we are right now. Now that leads to you know, this concept of what is a clinical trial and why do we need those, right? So again, a clinical trial it's basically a research study which is conducted in human beings with a specific goal, and that goal is answering a question. And that question always has to do with new therapies, vaccines, maybe with procedures, or better and innovative ways to use existing treatments with a different purpose. But you would never know if that works or not if you don't try. Now, those clinical trials are definitely used to determine whether those drugs that are existent or being studied at the moment are both safe and effective. That applies also to diagnostics and treatment. It is important to say that every single clinical trial is carefully conducted, and you know, this is just the fastest and the safest way to see if A, B, or C intervention it's gonna work. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about these phases of clinical trials. It's important because when I talk with patients about clinical trials, the first thing that comes to mind is, am I gonna be the guinea pig, right? It's not the case, you know. Most of the trials, you know, start from a phase 1 trial, and in order for a medication or an investigational agent to get to phase 1, you know, there has been before that a number of experiments and observations at a cellular level, you know, with mice, and there's always some sense of confidence that this is not gonna kill people, that this is gonna work, and there's a hope that this is gonna work at the end. So phase 1, basically, we look for safety, we look for safety signals, but as well for early signals of efficacy. So we don't take that many patients on that phase 1, right? But when we're able to recognize the right amount of dosage that the new medication it's going to be for the phase 1. It's when you make the big jump. And on phase 1, you pay attention not just to whether it's safe, because we already know it's safe, but whether it works. And that's why you need more people. If you're able to see that 1, this is safe, and 2, that this is works, then you make the jump to phase 3, which is, for the most part, those are large trials, and are always a comparison in between the medication which is coming down the pipe and with it are supposed to be the standard of care treatment for the condition that you're investigating. And then the medication gets approved if the trial is successful. And the phase 4 type of trial is basically post-marketing on safety and efficacy. So it is a journey, right? It's not just a sprint, it's a journey. It's something that takes time, it takes a village. And as I was saying, unfortunately, we minorities are still underrepresented. So what are some of those roadblocks that we see, not just for Hispanics, but for African Americans, for Pacific Islanders? Sometimes people don't even know that there's a clinical trial as an option. Sometimes they don't know the logistics of participating in a clinical trial. Most of the time, they are concerned about side effects. Sometimes there's, and I have encountered this a number of times, right? The fear of distrust, not just in the physician, but in the system as a whole. There's also this historical concept of discrimination in medical research. And of course, one that applies for minorities is the inconvenience of logistics that come with the trial, right? The time that the commitment of time for the trial, the distance in between your residence and the site that is conducting the trial, the number of procedures, the number of visits, and the financial burden. So those are many of those roadblocks that are not unheard, and we really need to make a better effort at overcoming those, so we can get our numbers better as far as enrollment. And so nowadays I'm using this picture. Okay, so look, this is my family, and this is June of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And I keep saying you need to live by example, right? So I was patient 900 on the Moderna trial of the COVID-19 vaccine. My wife was the patient 750 on the Pfizer trial. My oldest daughter is 5 years old. By then she was 3.5. She participated in the we made her to participate in the clinical trial of Pfizer for kids in between 2 to 5 years old. And then my youngest, she was 1.5 years, and she participated in the 6 months to 2 years old trial of Pfizer for COVID. So it is an experience, Sometimes you predicate about clinical trials, but also you have to be on the other side of the fence. You have to understand, what the logistics are, and just to share, we didn't have the opportunity of the Pfizer trial for kids here in San Antonio. We have to make the accommodations to travel to Corpus Christi, which is 2.5 hours. But people over there, they were really kind. We not just us, but in general, patients get reimbursed for for gas, for mileage, for your time. And they make the extra effort. They walk the extra mile just to having a minority participant in a clinical trial. So this is really what we need. We need to have more representation of minorities, so we better understand the data, and we can make sure that our results on a clinical trial can be extrapolated to the population as a whole. So with that, I'm
Great.
gonna.
Well, what a beautiful family, and thank you for participating in those clinical trials. And I think something very important that you've just shared here is that we have to trust the clinical trials because they have gone through these different phases of testing, so that by the time they're truly recruiting more individuals to participate, that they have really improved the efficacy of the trial. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Well, our next speaker is Dr. Segarra-Vázquez, and I wanted to ask you, and if you don't mind, I want to go by Barbara. Barbara and I go back a long time to talk a little bit about how you view Latinos participating in clinical trials and why. And I know you've been an advocate for many, many years now as well. So, Barbara.
Thank you. First off, thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I have been, as you mentioned, a patient advocate for more than 10 years. And even though I have a science background, I didn't know much about clinical trials, not even when I was receiving treatment for breast cancer back in 2003. Diagnostic and therapeutic decisions of Latinos are based on data of populations that were not like us, right? So as an advocate, I have been able to learn about the processes and details that go into the clinical trial, like Dr. Diaz mentioned, all the process and the strict steps that it goes before it gets to a person to participate. I think it is important. For me, the most important thing is for the general population to understand what clinical trials are, as well as the benefit and the impact. In the last couple of years, we have listened a lot about clinical trials and FDA because of COVID-19 pandemic. And moreover, we have witnessed how diagnostic testing, treatments, and vaccines were developed because of science. So as stated at the beginning of the session, participation of Latinos in clinical trials is very low. And there are many reasons. And for me, again, education, maybe because I'm a professor, right, is the key of everything. And we should be talking about clinical trials all the time to everybody, since they're little and since you're adult. Because when you're diagnosed with a disease such as cancer, you're overwhelmed and trying to understand what is happening to you. And then on top of that, trying to understand what is a clinical trial. And if it's good for you, it could be very scary. Some of the myths is, for a clinician especially, is that Latinos do not want to participate in clinical trials. And that has affected the enrollment of Latinos in trials. And Latinos do want to participate in trials. And the truth is, they are not invited. Sometimes they are not asked to participate. I have talked to researchers here in Puerto Rico. They all speak Spanish. Their patients or participants speak Spanish. And they tell me they are eager to participate, and not only participate, they stay in the trial. So the attrition is very low. So if you're a patient, Amelie mentioned at the beginning a few important things that have been discovered through research. And most every medication or treatment or different things that we have is because of clinical trials. So it's important. And some for patients, they're missed as well. As Dr. Diaz mentioned, many people think they're gonna still be guinea pig, right? And we have to reassure patients that is not true. And there's a strict process all since the idea up to when the trial is delivered. Other patients think, well, the doctor should decide for me. And that's not true. You're the patient. You should be the one asking for clinical trials. And you will think that maybe only clinical trials are available in big academic centers, but that's not true as well. You can find in the community. But then it goes back to education. We have to talk to this to our patients all the time. So there's pros and cons of participating in trials if you're a patient, right? Because you could try a new treatment drug. And in a conference I was recently, one of the speakers said, participating in a clinical trial is receiving today the treatment of tomorrow, right? Because you have that opportunity to participate. And our population have not been able. you contribute to research, right? I'm a two-time breast cancer survivor, and I know I'm here because many patients participated in clinical trials to decide and learn how to treat the different types of cancer, right? And so there's cons in terms of eligibility, and especially for our population, that is a burden because they're very strict. And for Latinos, diabetes, for example, is 14 to 60%. And if you exclude diabetic people from trials, then you're excluding a quarter of the Latinos, right? So sometimes if you participate in a clinical trial, it's not guaranteed that you're going to be in the new treatment. So there's things that you have to really discuss with your clinician in order to decide if you're going to participate or not. And there's different sites for patient. Komen has a site that has different questions that you can ask your clinician if they invite you to participate, or you can ask them if there's a trial out there and what is it for, what does it mean, how would it affect me? And feel free to ask all the questions that you can when you have the time, right? Dr. Diaz covered a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, the barriers of including our enrollment of Latinos, is access to academic centers. A lot of the trials happen in big academic centers, and that could be difficult, right, to get to those academic centers. Is lack of information available. I didn't know there were trials when I was diagnosed, right? Because we are not educated in that way. Absent of cultural consideration, like Dr. Diaz mentioned, there's a huge barrier in language, right? We think that because you live in the United States, everybody speaks English. And Dr. Diaz shared with us the percent of people, 40%, I think he mentioned, that don't speak English at all. I was in Florida visiting my sons in Orlando, and I was amazed. Everybody was speaking Spanish all the time. So we kind of, or at least the system, forgets that that's there, right? So if you're diagnosed with cancer, understanding the language, how could it be not understanding what they're saying and trying to understand what a clinical trial is? There's psychological aspects like fear, mistrust, uncertainty, and trial logistic, like Dr. Diaz mentioned as well, right? And when we talk about the Latinos, they're usually low-income people, and so trying to participate in these trials come to a cost, right? Like you were mentioning, Dr. Diaz, getting to the center, taking a day off, the cost of it, and if you live with a strict budget, right, having to have money for transportation, gasoline, or things like that is going to be it's going to be hard for our population. And a study showed, a study that I read, a relation between income and trial participation. And in that study, they learned or stated that white patients enter larger randomized trial when compared to Latinos. And it goes again to the means that you have to participate, right? Because if you live in a budget, you cannot do that. And there was another study that came out in JAMA last year, and it was saying that Black and Hispanic patients in particular were underrepresented in trials that led to cancer drug approvals. And we have seen how cancer affects our community. So we have to participate. Facilitators to increase participation, I think having investigators and clinicians, just like Dr. Diaz, that we can relate to, is really going to increase, right? Because trust goes there, and you see people like you, and you feel comfortable talking to them. Partnership with communities, culturally adapted study designs, availability of the materials in Spanish, in the or other language if you want to increase minorities. Staff that relates to the community. You cannot run a clinical trial for Latinos and nobody in your staff or coordinator or the nurse or anybody speaks Spanish, because then it's going to be a huge barrier right there, right? We have to have incentive for these people to participate because they won't have the money for gas or parking or even lunch or to take a day of work, right? Sometimes people just live what they work. So if they don't work, they don't have sick days or anything to take them. And liaisons with the community, right? I met a group of researchers from Yale University, and they have a huge connection with the Latino community, mostly Puerto Ricans. called La Junta, and they have ambassadors in that community that the researchers go to present their ideas and help them in enrollment. And when we talk about increasing diversity in trials, I think it goes beyond patients. It goes beyond, we have to have more advocates like me. There's a lack of Latina advocates talking and encouraging other people. There's a lack of researchers, of minority researchers receiving grants and participating. So the system has to do better, even the funders who give money for these grants. So these are only a few aspects, and I know we're going to have a conversation that we'll add, but if you're a patient, ask. I think it should not be the burden of the patient to ask. It should be the clinicians who should offer or sit with the patient and look for options. But until that happens, as a patient, you have the right to ask, and it's justice for all. So thank you.
Great. No, thank you so much, Barbara. Great information, and thank you for sharing. Dr. Acosta, we have a question in the chat here, and it's what is Genentech doing to help improve our consent forms and the tools that are available to truly help facilitate the recruitment of Latinos into clinical trials? Because sometimes those consent forms are so overwhelming if the patient really doesn't understand what they're signing or what they're really getting into. Any thoughts there?
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to, Dr. Segarra was saying all these things, and I was just check the box, because those are the things actually we look at that. And also I was really pleased with Dr. Diaz Duque presentation, and I think I just want to applaud him and his family, because, as you said, leading by example is a way to actually get more community members to really understand the importance to do what he did with his family. So, kudos to them as well. I think that, from the point of view of Genentech, I have to say that the first thing that we do is that, and we did actually, particularly on the study that I'm talking about multiple sclerosis, is that we work with the community. We work with the patients and the design of the study. We work with the patient association. We work with the experts in the area, so they could actually help us to design something that really fits the needs of the patient. And one of the things that we learned from the beginning is, those materials, not only as Dr. Segarra was saying, are in English, and we would like to have materials in Spanish. So we immediately accommodate to be able to have all the materials in Spanish. And the second one is, listen to the patients. When you read these, can you understand? And when we look at the informed consent, these are papers, for those who are not familiar with this, that you as a patient actually consent to the study. And you can always remove the consent if you don't want to continue in the study. It's not like you are bound to the study if you decide that that's not what you want to do down the road. But that informed consent can be 12, 14, 15, 17, 20 pages. And as you know, people can fall asleep in the middle of the process, or by the page number 3, they don't remember exactly what we're trying to explain to them. So what we tried to do was to create a short form, right, where is a very easy 1 or 2 pages that also the healthcare professional can really communicate quickly with the patient, understand what it's about, etc. So they really feel comfortable that they really got the essential and the most important information they need in order to make a decision. So I think that from our perspective has been from the beginning, from the moment that we preconceive, the conception of the study, the design of the protocol, etc., the patient is actually working with us. And then obviously we take that and we put it towards the patient. And one thing that Dr. Segarra said is that we build actually in studies all these things that we know could be a problem. Childcare is a big issue, particularly when you have female clinical studies like MMS. So we want to make sure that that is covered. We want to make sure that if they have to miss a day of work, those things are covered. The transportation, how do we actually facilitate for them to get to the site or to get to where they need to go? So there is a lot of things that we put in place that we try all together really, so we can have the success of bringing this minority representation into our clinical studies.
Thank you. All of those points are so important, because I know that when we first started, many times we didn't even have the consent forms in Spanish. So that was a big rate limiting factor for individuals who were predominantly Spanish speaking. So good to hear that you're getting that community input and developing those forms as to be a little bit more understandable from the patient perspective.
Yep.
Dr. Diaz, what methods do you use to help promote clinical trials in your studies and to encourage Latinos to participate?
So webinars like yours, it's like I use. Yeah. And I've learned throughout the years that, you know, if you don't go to the mountain, you have to make the mountain come to you. So if you want to get the enrollment boost up, you have to go out there and find those patients, right? And what I have done lately is I go out there to community practices where there's no presence of academia. I get in touch with oncologists in the community that are not, and sadly speaking, sometimes they are not even aware of the presence of clinical trials, and clinical trials that are so simple. Clinical trials that do not require long times on PKs, maybe 1, 2, or 3 visits, right? And it's really easy to leverage infrastructure from our side to their side. And so that's a really good way to promote clinical trials. Talks for societies like Leukemia Research Foundation or Leukemia Lymphoma Society. Those are good venues as well. And I'm speaking of investigators in general, we are always thinking about switching the way we think when a patient comes to the office. So just to use a very simple example, for the most common lymphoproliferative disease, which is diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, we treat with curative intent, right? With a combination of chemo and immunotherapy, which has been in the market for more than 20 years. And it cures 6 to 7 people out of 10. But is it really the best? Or is there anything better, right? And it's because of questions like that and because of the effort that we made as investigators that we were able to find so far sometimes some combination that looks like better. And what I'm trying to say, the point that I'm trying to make is sometimes there are better options that you may need to explain to the patient and make your point comparing those to what is considered standard of care.
Great, good. Well, thank you so much. And Dr. Segarra, from your perspective, have you found a campaign that really embodied some of the elements that we've been talking about, or an example of a successful clinical trial campaign?
Well, not yet, right? And I think they forget, and Latinos, we all look different, right? We cannot say, take a picture of me and say, this is a Latina, right? Because all of us, I think, in this talk are Latinos and we all look different, right? But there's certain characteristics with the language or the background, and up to now I have not seen one, right? And we just have to keep talking to the patients, as Dr. Acosta said, and like Dr. Diaz does, because that's where the information is going to come. What do we need to see? What do we want to know, right? And another comment I wanted to make is, as patients, it's important to understand, like Dr. Diaz was just mentioning, that even though this is kind of the standard of care now, science will tell us different in a few years. I was first diagnosed in 2003, and it was a stage 2B. And the way it's treated now is a bit different of the way I was treated, right? And I cannot say, oh, they gave me extra chemo, they should have given me less, because that's what we knew at the time. And my oncologist that I had, my first oncologist that sadly passed away of a heart condition a few years ago, he always, when I first started with him, he says, numbers are numbers, and everything depends on the science, and the science is changing every day, right? So we, as patients, we have to be hopeful. And I think the only thing that really keep us going is staying there alive for the next better treatment out there. And nothing is going to be discovered if it's not through science. So as patients, we have, and there's different trials. If you're a patient, it doesn't mean that you have to be in a treatment trial. If you already passed your treatment, there's wellness treatments, there's exercise treatments, there's just to look at the genes or to gather data. There's a lot of new trials going on in gathering data to see how we are different or similar to others. And those are things that, okay, we can say, oh no, I'm already cured, I don't have to participate. Let's keep looking of opportunities to share our information and to really help science move forward.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Acosta, I think Dr. Segarra, brought up an important point in terms of trust. How do we build more trust in our community about clinical trials?
Well, I think that, the example that Dr. Diaz gave before, I think that is important. The education is important to have the ability for the HCP, for the provider, basically to really represent this. I think that we as a biopharmaceutical company, we try to do as much as we can and provide the information and the education, and also provide, the support to be able for the execution of this type of activities that allows the information to get to the right place, to the right patients, and to the right family members too, because sometimes it's the family member who hears that something is going on and then they made the association. I think that the more we can get out there, the more we can actually communicate. I think to me is a way that we can proactively be out there and try to explain to the patients, and events like these actually help us to reach the communities. I think that we can look into that. We can look, how do we connect with the community better? What do we learn from that? How can we use these social networks actually to have more ability to reach a larger population of patients? I think that, when the more we do that, when we look at the diversification of the healthcare personnel, you said that before, if a patient identifies with the doctor, with the nurse, etc., it may be easier from that perspective to do the communication. So, create good experiences. I think that this is something where we're not going out there because we want to bring more minorities. We really want to create the experience, and the understanding that the reason why we need this is because the only way we can treat patients with the right treatment, with the right dose, understand the side effects that this medication can have, if we have the right representation. You mentioned Alzheimer's before, and a recent conditional approval drug for Alzheimer's. When you look at the Hispanic, it was less than 1%. And when I'm a neurologist and you tell me there are no Alzheimer's patients in the Hispanic community, the problem is that they were not able to bring those patients in. And I think that we are working basically to solve this issue. I think that the more we can communicate, the more patients feel comfortable with us, especially with the biopharmaceutical. We're doing this because, as I said before, we want the best clinical outcomes for everybody. We don't want to tell you this drug is going to work on you if it was testing in 95% of people who does not look like you, because I don't know exactly if it's the right drug for you. And I think the more we create the movement to bring what we call minority now, and remember, we're going to be majority in a few years, is that we really need to make sure that what we're using is the right thing for the right patient and for our community. So whatever we can do to continue to educate and to bring this patient to the clinical study, I think that we're going to be committed to that.
Great, thank you. We have another great question from Erica in our audience, and I wanted to direct it to Dr. Diaz. Dr. Diaz, she's asking in terms of an important point that you made, that we need to outreach to our community providers, right? Because sometimes they're not aware of these clinical trials that are occurring in academic health centers. So how can community providers find out about clinical trials in case they have a patient that they would like to refer? How can they make that connection easier?
That's a hard one. That's a hard one, and every single institution has its own challenges. I can tell that because not just here in Texas, but for instance, collaborators in Memorias Sloan Kettering, University of Miami, or even Emory have the same problem, and it all goes to the network that you established, right? Every academic institution has an area to cover. And as I was mentioned, South Texas is our target. And you just have to start building up your network and ensure that your channels of communications are wide open to physicians in the community. As I was mentioning, I was really surprised of how physicians in the South Texas didn't know or were not aware of easy clinical trials or medications coming down the path that are now or about to become standard of care. So it's a challenge, Erica, and it's something that we are really working on.
Yeah, and I think also it's difficult to maintain lists of some of our clinical trials, right? Because some of them are small trials because now things are becoming like more precision oriented and you only need a few participants, and then others, you need larger numbers. So it's something that's constantly changing. I do know that NCI has a major list of trials and they do try to refer you to the different cancer centers. So just for Elisa, that's one way of trying to find, or Erica, in terms of where to find a provider that might be providing a clinical trial nearest you, because it's not always close by.
Right, and the other thing, what I try to explain to the patients when there's a clinical trial is, it's like when you're trying to buy a ticket for a flight, right? The plane is there and you want to make sure that you get a chair, in that flight, and that's when you start screening patients. But sometimes, the flight is there, but there are no chairs, there are no slots. So the information is always fluid, there's a number of trials, there's a number of options, and we want to make sure that the right patient gets screened to the right trial.
Thank you. And another question that came up with Dr. Acosta, this one was from Elisa, in terms of what are we doing to educate healthcare providers to, encourage them to offer clinical trials to their patients?
Well, I think that from the perspective of the providers that are participating in the clinical study, what we're doing is create awareness about the importance to incorporate minorities into the study. So I think that's the first thing. Understand that this is an issue, that there has to be an effort, and how can we work on that? And also, strategically, we're thinking, how can we reach more providers and educate them and make them and help them to participate in clinical studies, which are not the traditional, and I think Dr. Segarra referred to that as well as Dr. Diaz, the traditional big academic centers, etc. So how can we start incorporating the more traditional community participant, community doctor to really be able to run this study? How can we empower them to do that? But in general, the participants, the investigators that participate in a study, we do a lot of the training, and also, how can we actually work with them to bring these minorities into the clinical study.
Great. And so thank you, that's great. And then Dr. Segarra, another question from one of our audience members, Francisco, is asking, are you aware of any resources for genomic terminology, or where can individuals find more information for Spanish speakers to provide them with the resources they might need?
Yeah, I don't, maybe through Susan G. Komen, they have a lot of things and translated in Spanish through their website. So there's, they have a glossary there, I imagine, but for Spanish, I know for sure Komen has. But those terminology and genetic, even in English, has been a challenge for patients to understand the difference between genetics and genomics and all these things. So it is an important point, and thank you for bringing. And I just wanted to add, and you know this because you're part of the group, Amelie, that ASCO, American Society for Clinical Oncology, had developed a few tools for clinicians and practices to self-assess to see if they are doing, how can they do better to recruit minorities, and other resources. So if you go to their website, you can find information on that. They have been working for that in the last year or so and have a few publications. So as clinicians or people that work with patients, that's a good resource.
Great, great. And Jenny from the audience also mentioned that clinicaltrials.gov is available in Spanish. So if anybody would like to look at that. And Deborah also mentioned a really good resource around barriers to clinical trials. And Cliff also mentioned that our Salud America, also we have quite a bit of information on clinical trials there. So if anybody's interested in going to our website and gathering that information. Well, wow, this has just been an amazing discussion. As we can all see, it's a complicated issue, but we're getting better. Things have really changed. I know I've been in the field for a little bit longer than I'd like to admit, and we're seeing changes. So thank you so much for all the new work that's going on, for the new colleagues that are working to try to make a difference. And we need to, both Dr. Segarra and I have worked on educating the future generation on clinical trials as well, and getting more diverse clinical providers involved in science. And so there's just some wonderful programs going on, and we need to encourage the diversity of our clinical providers. And sometimes our own communities serve as roadblocks, and some of the students that I heard from, and sometimes their own parents tell them, why do you need more education? Why can't you just go out and work, when they want to go for an MD or a PhD, or, to truly change their lives. And we need to be supportive, for many of these individuals, and help connect them with individuals that can make a difference in their lives. So I'd like to just a few closing remarks. I really want to thank you all for attending. It's so important to hear from our physicians, our survivors, and our advocates who are working really hard to improve clinical trial participation, not only among Latinos, but all our underrepresented minorities. And we know clinical trials can spark new discoveries. And as was said earlier, we just want to bring the latest and the best to our communities. And that's what it's all about, is trying to create a better opportunities for our future generations. And one of the things that I know that Barbara and I have worked very closely with a lot of breast cancer survivors, and they're some of the most giving individuals that I've seen, and unselfish, and so sometimes it's participating in these trials, not knowing what immediate impact it's going to have on you, but again, to help that future generation and your family. So there's also the importance of contributing to biospecimen donation. Again, these biospecimens are used to help us design new, learn better about how cancer works in different populations and what might be causing these different health disorders. And so we really encourage individuals to learn more about biospecimens. We have a bilingual fact sheet that's available through Salud America. If you go to salud.to/biospecimen, it's available in English and Spanish. So again, thank you very much to our panelists. You all did an amazing job. We're very thankful. Our next webinar, as part of the series, will be on October the 4th. And this one is really geared to reaching out to women, and why should women get screened for cancer and have their family members get screened. So we hope that you will join us then. And on behalf of Salud America, and Genentech, we really want to thank you for your attention this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again. So mil gracias por todo. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, well,